The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Marcus Williams first approached the young woman with a confident stride and warm smile outside the New Hampshire campaign office. His weathered hands trembled slightly, not from the December cold, but from the crushing weight of pride finally surrendering to desperation. The cardboard sign he clutched bore the words, "Veteran, anything helps," written in black marker that had started to smudge in the moisture. His voice, once strong enough to bark orders across a military compound in Kandahar, cracked like a teenage boy's when he spoke those first desperate words, "Ma'am, I don't usually do this, but I'm at the end of my rope." The woman stopped walking, turned to face him completely, and in that single moment of acknowledgement, something shifted in the universe. What happened next would not only transform Marcus's life, but reveal the profound, often hidden power of human compassion in a world that had seemingly forgotten how to truly see one another. Marcus Anthony Williams had been living in his rusted 1998 Honda Civic for exactly 43 days when the December cold finally shattered what remained of his dignity. Each morning he would wake with his knees pressed against the dashboard, his back screaming from another night contorted across the front seats, frost covering the inside of his windows like prison bars made of ice. The car smelled of stale coffee, unwashed clothes, and the peculiar mustiness that settles into fabric when hope begins to rot. At 42, Marcus carried himself with the bearing of a soldier, even in his darkest hour. His shoulders remained squared, despite the weight of invisible burdens. His gray eyes still held flecks of the determination that had carried him through 2 tours in Afghanistan, and his handshake, when anyone bothered to shake his hand anymore, retained the firm grip his drill sergeant had demanded 24 years earlier. But beneath that military composure, Marcus was drowning. The morning of December 15th began like all the others in recent weeks. Marcus woke at 05:00 hours-old habits die hard, and performed his abbreviated morning routine in the parking lot of a 24-hour Walmart. He brushed his teeth using bottled water and spit into the storm drain, washed his face with wet wipes, and changed into the least wrinkled of his 3 remaining shirts. The reflection in his car's side mirror showed a man who looked older than his years, with gray creeping through his brown hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. The purple heart medal sat in a small wooden box on his passenger seat, the only possession he couldn't bring himself to sell. Next to it lay a stack of rejection letters from employers, past due notices from creditors, and a photograph of his mother, Eleanor Williams, taken just weeks before the cancer finally claimed her life 6 months earlier. "Morning, Mom," he whispered to the photograph, a ritual that had become both comfort and torture. Still trying to figure this out. Eleanor had been a nurse for 37 years, dedicated her life to caring for others, and died owing $127,000 in medical bills despite having insurance. Marcus had liquidated his 401k, sold his truck, his furniture, even his father's vintage watch to pay for experimental treatments that ultimately bought them 6 extra months together. When she passed, he discovered that love, no matter how fierce, cannot resurrect the dead or erase debt. The job market proved merciless for a veteran with gaps in employment history and a medical file documenting PTSD episodes. Marcus had mechanical skills honed during his military service. He could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, and had once kept a Humvee running with duct tape and determination through a 3-day firefight. But civilian employers saw only the red flags. The tremor in his hands during stressful moments, the way he flinched at sudden loud noises, the fact that he'd been unemployed for 8 months. The VA benefits system, that labyrinthine bureaucracy designed to help veterans like him, had become his daily torment. Forms led to more forms. Appointments were scheduled months in advance, only to be canceled at the last minute. Caseworkers changed so frequently that Marcus found himself explaining his situation to a new person every few weeks, each one requiring him to relive his trauma as proof of his need. That morning, as frost covered his windshield and his breath formed small clouds in the frigid air inside his car, Marcus made a decision that went against everything he'd been taught about self-reliance, military pride, and personal responsibility. He would ask for help from a stranger. He had noticed the young woman before. She worked in the political campaign office across from the Walmart parking lot where he'd been spending his nights. Every morning around 8:30, she would arrive with purposeful steps and a coffee that steamed in the cold air. She looked successful, put together, the kind of person who had never worried about where her next meal would come from. But there was something in her demeanor, a quality Marcus couldn't quite name, that suggested she might listen without judgment. As he watched her approach the office that morning, Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs. His palms grew sweaty despite the cold. This was harder than facing enemy fire, harder than watching his mother take her last breath, harder than anything he'd ever done. But the alternative, another night in his car, another day of slow starvation, another step closer to complete invisibility, was worse than the shame. Karoline Leavitt was running exactly 7 minutes behind schedule when she noticed the man standing near the campaign office entrance. At 26, she had already developed the politician's instinct for reading people quickly. Potential supporters, troublemakers, reporters, looking for a quote. But this man didn't fit any of her usual categories. He stood with military precision, despite obviously difficult circumstances, holding what appeared to be a handmade sign, and there was something in his posture that spoke of dignity under pressure. She had been thinking about her morning schedule, a conference call with donors at 9 o'clock, followed by a policy briefing, then 3 different interviews about her legislative priorities. Her mind was already racing through talking points and strategic considerations when the man cleared his throat and spoke. "Excuse me, ma'am?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the controlled cadence of someone accustomed to military protocol. "I know you're busy, and I'm truly sorry to bother you, but I saw your campaign sign about helping working families and veterans. I'm not sure if someone like me counts, but I'm a veteran, and I'm—" He paused, and she could see him struggling with the words. "I'm homeless." The simple statement hit Karoline with unexpected force. She had given dozens of speeches about supporting veterans, had voted on legislation intended to address homelessness, had participated in countless policy discussions about these exact issues. But standing face-to-face with someone living these statistics transformed abstract policy into immediate human reality. Instead of the polite deflection or hurried referral that Marcus had expected, Karoline stopped completely. She looked directly into his eyes, gray eyes that held both exhaustion and a flicker of the pride that was costing him so much to set aside, and made a decision that would alter both of their lives. "You served our country," she said, her voice carrying conviction that surprised even her. "You absolutely count. What's your name?" "Marcus Williams, ma'am." "Sergeant Marcus Williams, retired." "Sergeant Williams, I'm Karoline Leavitt. Tell me what's happening." The invitation to speak, delivered without impatience or condescension, opened something in Marcus that had been locked away for months. Standing in the December wind, with early morning traffic creating a backdrop of ordinary life continuing around them, he found himself telling his story to a stranger who listened as if his words mattered. "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan," Marcus began, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. "Got out in 2019, used my GI benefits to learn automotive repair, and was doing okay for a while. Had my own apartment, steady work at a garage downtown. Then my mother got sick." He told her about Eleanor Williams, about the way cancer had stolen her strength bit by bit, while the medical bills mounted like snow during a blizzard. He described the impossible choices: pay for her medication or pay rent, take her to yet another specialist or buy groceries, hope for a miracle treatment or accept that love isn't enough to stop death. "I was making decent money as a mechanic," Marcus continued, his hands gesturing as he spoke, animated by the relief of finally being heard. $42,000 a year, which isn't rich, but it was enough. But when Mom got sick, the bills just kept coming. Chemotherapy sessions at $800 each, radiation treatments, experimental drugs that the insurance company called investigational and refused to cover. I sold everything I owned, worked double shifts when I could get them, took out loans against my credit cards." His voice cracked slightly. "She died anyway. 6 months ago yesterday, and I lost everything trying to save her." Karoline listened without interrupting, asking questions that demonstrated she understood the complexity of a situation. She didn't offer empty sympathy or political talking points. Instead, she pulled out her phone and began making calls with the focused intensity of someone who had decided to solve a problem. "Hi, this is Karoline Leavitt calling about emergency housing assistance for a veteran." "Yes, I can hold." She looked at Marcus and smiled. Not the practiced campaign smile he might have expected, but something genuine and warm. "We're going to figure this out, Sergeant Williams." The first call led to a second, then a third. Karoline's fingers flew across her phone screen as she accessed contacts, sent text messages, and navigated bureaucratic systems with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making things happen. Marcus watched in amazement as this young woman, who had no obligation to help him, mobilized resources on his behalf with the dedication of a military commander executing a mission. Within 90 minutes, Karoline had connected Marcus with Jennifer Hayes, a veterans advocate who specialized in emergency assistance cases. She had arranged temporary housing at the Granite State Veterans Shelter, a facility specifically designed for former service members facing homelessness. Most remarkably, she had personally driven Marcus to the Manchester VA office and used her position and persistence to demand immediate attention for his stalled benefits application. "The system failed you," she told him as they sat in the VA waiting room, surrounded by other veterans in various states of need and frustration. "But that doesn't mean people have to fail each other." By noon that day, Marcus had a bed for the night, an appointment with a benefits counselor for the following morning, and something he hadn't felt in months: hope. What distinguished Karoline's response from typical political charity wasn't just the immediate assistance. It was her refusal to treat Marcus's situation as a one-time good deed that would make her feel better about herself. Over the following days and weeks, she maintained contact not as a politician accumulating positive publicity, but as one human being genuinely invested in another's well-being. The Granite State Veterans Shelter proved to be exactly what Marcus needed: a clean, safe environment run by people who understood the unique challenges facing former service members. His caseworker, Tom Rodriguez, was himself a Vietnam veteran who had experienced homelessness decades earlier and dedicated his career to helping others navigate the same treacherous waters. "The thing about being homeless," Tom explained during their first meeting, "is that it becomes all-consuming. Every decision revolves around basic survival: where to sleep, where to get food, where to shower, where to use the bathroom with dignity. It's impossible to think about long-term solutions when you're trapped in short-term crisis mode." The shelter provided more than just a bed and meals. Marcus found himself part of a community of men who shared similar struggles, each carrying invisible wounds from their service and visible scars from a society that had failed to fulfill its promises to them. There was James, a Navy veteran whose drinking had cost him his family and his job. David, an Army Ranger whose PTSD made it impossible to hold employment. Robert, a Marine whose physical disabilities from an IED explosion had left him unable to work, but caught in the bureaucratic purgatory of disability determinations. Initially, Marcus kept to himself, still processing the shame of needing help despite his logical understanding that circumstances beyond his control had led to his situation. But gradually, as he listened to other men's stories during group meals and informal conversations, he began to understand that asking for help required a different kind of courage than he'd ever needed in combat. Karoline visited regularly, always bringing practical assistance disguised as friendly conversation. She helped Marcus navigate the complex process of accessing his delayed veterans' benefits, connecting him with Linda Patterson, a social worker who specialized in cutting through VA bureaucracy. She arranged for him to see Dr. Sarah Chen, a therapist who had extensive experience treating veterans with PTSD and who accepted patients on a sliding fee scale. "I kept waiting for the catch," Marcus would later recall. "In my experience, people, especially politicians, don't just help without wanting something in return. A photo opportunity, a testimonial, some way to benefit from your situation. But Karoline never asked for anything. She never brought cameras, never posted about our meetings on social media, never made me feel like a project or a campaign prop." The breakthrough came in early January, when Karoline learned about Marcus's mechanical expertise. During one of their conversations, he had mentioned his ability to diagnose automotive problems, his years of experience maintaining military vehicles, and his genuine love for the precision and problem-solving aspects of mechanical work. "I miss it," he had admitted. "There's something satisfying about taking an engine that won't run and figuring out exactly what's wrong, then fixing it. Cars don't lie to you. Either they work or they don't, and there's always a logical reason when they don't." Karoline immediately began reaching out to her network of local business owners, looking for someone willing to give Marcus a chance. Her search led her to Jim Sullivan, owner of Sullivan's Auto Repair, a small but well-respected garage that specialized in both foreign and domestic vehicles. Jim was initially skeptical. He had been burned before by employees who looked good on paper but couldn't handle the responsibility of steady work. He had learned to be cautious about hiring people with gaps in their employment history or obvious personal struggles. But something in Karoline's description of Marcus intrigued him. She didn't try to oversell him or make excuses for his situation, Jim would later explain. She was honest about what he'd been through, but she also talked about his skills, his military background, his work ethic. She said something that stuck with me. He doesn't need charity, he needs opportunity. The interview was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late January. Marcus spent the entire weekend reviewing automotive repair manuals from the library, practicing answers to potential questions, and fighting off the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm him. Karoline had helped him find a suit at the local Goodwill, and Tom Rodriguez had arranged for him to use the shelter's computer to print copies of his military service record and the certifications he had earned during his mechanic training. Monday night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in his narrow shelter bed, listening to the sounds of other men dealing with their own demons. Someone crying softly, another man talking in his sleep, the rustle of blankets as nightmares interrupted rest. He thought about his mother, about the garage where he had worked before her illness, about the pride he had once felt in his skills and his independence. At 0500 hours, he rose and began preparing for what felt like the most important mission of his civilian life. Marcus arrived at Sullivan's Auto Repair 30 minutes early, wearing the navy blue suit that Karoline had helped him select, and carrying a folder containing his military service record, his automotive certifications, and 3 letters of recommendation that Tom Rodriguez had helped him obtain from his former supervisors and fellow veterans. The garage occupied a corner lot in Manchester's industrial district, its 2 service bays bustling with activity even at 8:30 in the morning. The smell of motor oil and brake fluid filled the air, familiar, comforting scents that reminded Marcus of competence and purpose. Through the office window, he could see Jim Sullivan reviewing paperwork, a man in his 50s with grease-stained hands and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades solving other people's problems. When Jim emerged from the office, Marcus stood and extended his hand with the firm grip and direct eye contact that military training had made automatic. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm Marcus Williams. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Jim's initial assessment was positive. Marcus looked professional despite obvious financial constraints. His suit was second-hand but clean and well-fitted. His shoes were polished, and his military bearing was evident in his posture and manner of speech. More importantly, when Jim began asking technical questions about automotive repair, Marcus's answers demonstrated both knowledge and enthusiasm. "Tell me about the most challenging repair you've ever completed," Jim requested, leaning back in his office chair. Marcus smiled for the first time in weeks as he described maintaining a convoy of Humvees in Afghanistan with limited resources and constant pressure. "We had this one vehicle that kept overheating, but we couldn't figure out why. Radiator was fine, coolant levels were good, thermostat had been replaced twice. Command needed it operational within 6 hours because we were heading out on patrol." His voice gained confidence as he continued. "I finally realized that the problem wasn't mechanical, it was environmental. Sand had infiltrated the cooling system in a way that wouldn't show up in normal diagnostics. Instead of replacing parts, I had to completely flush the system with a solution I mixed from cleaning supplies and distilled water. The vehicle ran perfectly for the next 8 months." Jim nodded approvingly. "What about working with customers? This isn't the military. People get emotional about their cars and they don't always understand what needs to be done." "I understand that," Marcus replied. "When someone brings their car in, it's not just a machine to them. It represents independence, security, the ability to get to work or take their kids to school. I learned from my mother that when people are worried, they need honest information delivered with patience and respect." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from diagnostic procedures to customer service philosophy. Jim was impressed not just by Marcus's technical knowledge, but by his thoughtful approach to problem solving and his obvious integrity. When Jim asked about the gap in his employment history, Marcus was ready with an honest answer that he had practiced with Tom Rodriguez. "I spent the last year caring for my mother while she battled cancer, and after she passed, I went through a difficult period adjusting to that loss while dealing with financial challenges. I'm not proud of needing help, but I'm grateful for the people who helped me get back on my feet. I'm ready to work, sir, and I can promise you won't regret giving me this chance." Jim Sullivan had been in business long enough to recognize authenticity when he heard it. "Marcus, I'm going to be straight with you. This job pays $15 an hour to start, with the possibility of raises based on performance. The work can be physically demanding, and some days will be more frustrating than others. But if you're willing to work hard, show up on time, and treat customers with respect, we can start with part-time hours and see how it goes." Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes. "Sir, you will not regret giving me this opportunity." They shook hands, and Jim watched Marcus walk back to the street where Karoline Leavitt was waiting in her car. Through the window, he could see her smile as Marcus gave her a thumbs up, and he witnessed the hug they shared, a moment of pure joy that reminded him why he had decided to take a chance on someone who needed one. Marcus's first day of work was scheduled for the following Monday. As he walked back to the shelter that afternoon, he felt something he hadn't experienced in almost a year: the anticipation of setting an alarm clock for a reason that mattered. Marcus's return to work proved to be about far more than earning a paycheck. From his first day at Sullivan's Auto Repair, he rediscovered aspects of himself that had been buried under months of survival, anxiety, and self-doubt. His hands remembered the familiar weight of tools, the satisfaction of diagnosing problems through careful observation and logical deduction, the quiet pride that came from transforming something broken into something functional. Jim Sullivan quickly recognized that he had made an excellent hiring decision. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early every day, stayed late when needed without being asked, and approached each repair job with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between success and failure. More importantly, for a customer service business, Marcus possessed the rare ability to explain complex mechanical issues in language that non-experts could understand. "He has this way of talking to customers that puts them completely at ease," Jim observed to his wife after Marcus's second week on the job. "Yesterday, Mrs. Patterson brought in her Honda with a transmission problem, and she was nearly in tears because she thought it was going to cost thousands of dollars. Marcus spent 20 minutes showing her exactly what was wrong, explaining her options, and helping her understand that it was actually a relatively minor issue. By the time she left, she was smiling and saying she'd recommend us to all her friends." The transformation wasn't lost on Marcus's fellow veterans at the shelter either. Where he had once been withdrawn and focused solely on his own survival, he began offering encouragement and practical advice to other men facing similar struggles. His success became a source of hope for the entire community. "Watching Marcus get back on his feet gave the rest of us permission to believe it was possible," explained James, the Navy veteran whose own journey toward stability had been inspired by Marcus's example. "He showed us that asking for help wasn't giving up, it was the first step in fighting back." By March, Marcus had moved into a small efficiency apartment above Sullivan's garage. The space was modest, 400 square feet with a kitchenette, a Murphy bed, and a single window that looked out over the parking lot. But it represented something profound: independence, privacy, and the ability to wake up in the same place he had gone to sleep. The first night in his apartment, Marcus sat on the floor, surrounded by the few possessions he had managed to accumulate: some clothes from the Goodwill, basic kitchen supplies, a small television that Jim had given him from the garage's waiting room, and the photograph of his mother that had traveled with him through his darkest months. "We did it, Mom," he whispered to the picture. "We're okay." His therapy sessions with Dr. Chen were helping him process not only his military trauma, but the complex grief and guilt surrounding his mother's death and his own period of homelessness. Through their conversations, Marcus began to understand that his experiences, while painful, had given him insights that could benefit others facing similar challenges. "Trauma doesn't have to define us," Dr. Chen explained during one particularly meaningful session. "But it can inform how we choose to help others who are struggling with their own difficulties. Your experiences have given you a unique perspective on resilience and the importance of community support." This insight planted the seed for what would become Marcus's most significant contribution to his recovery community. 6. Paying it forward. As spring arrived in New Hampshire, Marcus made a decision that surprised even those who knew him best. He wanted to give back, not out of obligation, but from a genuine desire to help other veterans navigate the treacherous path from crisis to stability. Working with Jennifer Hayes, the veterans advocate who had first helped him access emergency services, Marcus began volunteering at support group meetings for homeless veterans. His role was simple but powerful: share his story and offer practical guidance to men and women who were fighting the same battles he had recently faced. The first support group meeting Marcus attended as a peer counselor was held in the basement of the First United Methodist Church, the same building where he had once received free meals during his darkest days. 15 veterans sat in folding chairs arranged in a circle, ranging in age from a 24-year-old Marine who had been struggling since returning from Iraq to a 67-year-old Vietnam veteran whose PTSD had cost him multiple jobs and relationships over the decades. "My name is Marcus Williams," he began, his voice steady and clear. 6 months ago, I was living in my car, convinced that I was invisible to the world and that my life had no value. I was wrong on both counts, but it took hitting rock bottom and finding the courage to ask for help before I could see that. He told them about the December morning when he had approached Karoline Leavitt, about the shame he had felt and the fear that had nearly prevented him from speaking. He described the bureaucratic maze of veteran services, the emotional challenge of accepting charity, and the gradual process of rebuilding not just his circumstances, but his sense of self-worth. "I can't promise that your journey will be easy," he said, making eye contact with each person in the circle. "But I can tell you that no matter how dark it gets, there are still people who care. The hardest part is believing that you deserve help, and then being brave enough to accept it." After the meeting, several veterans approached Marcus privately to ask specific questions about navigating the VA system, finding temporary housing, or accessing mental health services. One young woman, a former Army medic named Sarah, broke down crying as she described her own struggles with homelessness and substance abuse. "I used to save lives," she sobbed. "How did I end up here?" Marcus placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're still the person who saved lives. That doesn't change, because you need help now. We're going to figure this out together." Word of Marcus's volunteer work reached Karoline, who had been following his progress with quiet satisfaction. She had maintained regular contact but had been careful not to hover or make him feel obligated to her kindness. When she learned about his peer counseling activities, she felt a deep pride that had nothing to do with politics or personal advancement. One evening in May, Karoline stopped by Sullivan's garage to have her car serviced, a legitimate need that also provided an opportunity to check on Marcus without making their interaction feel forced or artificial. When she arrived, she found him confidently explaining a repair estimate to another customer, his professional demeanor and obvious expertise, a stark contrast to the desperate, trembling man she had first encountered 5 months earlier. "The brake pads are definitely worn and need to be replaced," Marcus was telling Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who had brought in her 2015 Corolla. "But the rotors are still in good condition, which saves you about $200. We can have it ready by tomorrow afternoon, and I'll show you what the new pads look like compared to the old ones, so you can see exactly what we've done." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled gratefully. "Young man, you explain things so clearly. I've been coming to auto shops for 40 years, and this is the first time anyone has taken the time to help me understand what's actually wrong with my car." After Mrs. Rodriguez left, Karoline approached Marcus with genuine admiration. "You look good," she told him. "Really, really good." Marcus smiled, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "I feel like myself again. Actually, I feel like a better version of myself than I was before all this happened. Strange how that works." They talked for several minutes about his volunteer work, his growing confidence in his job, and his plans to eventually move into a larger apartment. As she prepared to leave, Marcus stopped her with a serious expression. "Karoline, I need you to know something. What you did for me that day, it wasn't just about the housing connections or the job referrals. You saw me as a person when I could barely see myself as human. You listened to my story like it mattered, like I mattered. That changes everything." She felt tears forming in her eyes. "You changed something in me too, Marcus. You reminded me why I got into public service in the first place. It's not about policy papers or campaign strategies. It's about real people facing real problems and figuring out how to help." By summer, Marcus's transformation had become visible to everyone who knew him. He had been promoted to senior mechanic at Sullivan's garage, earning both increased responsibility and a significant raise. His apartment had been furnished with items he had purchased himself: a real bed, a dining table, a bookshelf filled with automotive repair manuals and novels he enjoyed reading in the evenings. More importantly, his volunteer work had expanded beyond the support group meetings. Marcus had partnered with the Granite State Veterans Shelter to create a job readiness program that combined practical skills training with emotional support. The program, which they called Tools for Tomorrow, helped homeless veterans develop both technical abilities and the confidence necessary to succeed in job interviews and workplace environments. "Marcus understands something that most people don't," explained Tom Rodriguez, who had become both a friend and professional collaborator. "Getting people back on their feet isn't just about addressing their immediate needs. It's about helping them remember who they are beyond their current circumstances. The program's first graduate was Sarah, the former Army medic who had been struggling with homelessness and addiction when she first met Marcus at the support group. Through Tools for Tomorrow, she had completed training as a certified nursing assistant and found employment at a local hospital. Her success story became a model for other veterans in the program. Karoline continued to follow Marcus's progress, but their relationship had evolved into something deeper than the politician-constituent dynamic that had initially brought them together. They had become genuine friends, bonded by shared experience and mutual respect. When Karoline faced criticism from political opponents who questioned her commitment to veterans' issues, Marcus's story became a powerful example of the difference that individual action could make in addressing systemic problems. During a particularly heated debate about veteran services funding, Karoline found herself thinking about Marcus's journey from desperation to stability. "We can argue about statistics and budget allocations," she told her colleagues, "but I've seen firsthand how the right combination of resources, dignity, and human connection can transform someone's life completely. The programs work when we fully fund them and when we remember that behind every statistic is a human being with a story that matters." 18 months after that December morning, when Marcus first approached Karoline for help, he stood before a packed auditorium at the New Hampshire Veterans Center, preparing to deliver the keynote address at the annual Veterans Services Conference. The audience included social workers, veteran advocates, government officials, and community leaders from across New England, people who had dedicated their careers to addressing the complex challenges facing former service members. Marcus wore a charcoal gray suit that he had purchased with his own money from a department store, not a thrift shop. His hair was neatly trimmed, his posture reflected both military discipline and civilian confidence, and his voice was strong and clear as he approached the podium. "Distinguished guests, fellow veterans, and advocates," he began, his words carrying the authority of lived experience. 18 months ago, I was homeless, hopeless, and convinced that I had become invisible to a world that had seemingly moved on without me. I thought I had nothing left to offer, that I was just another casualty of a system that talks eloquently about supporting veterans, but often fails to follow through with meaningful action. He paused, scanning the audience and making eye contact with Karoline, who sat in the third row with tears already streaming down her face. Next to her sat Jim Sullivan, Tom Rodriguez, Dr. Chen, and several of the veterans whose lives had been touched by Marcus's volunteer work. But one person changed everything by doing something incredibly simple and incredibly rare in our modern world. She stopped, she listened, and she saw me as a human being worthy of dignity and assistance. That single moment of compassion created a ripple effect that I'm still feeling today, and that has touched dozens of other lives in ways we're only beginning to understand. Marcus went on to describe his journey from homelessness to stability, from despair to purpose, but he was careful to emphasize that his story was not unique in its challenges, only in its outcome. He spoke about the garage where he now worked as senior mechanic, the apartment he had recently moved into, a 2-bedroom space that allowed him to host other veterans who were transitioning from homelessness, and the job readiness program that had helped 17 veterans find stable employment in the past year. "I'm not sharing this story to make anyone feel sorry for me, or to suggest that individual charity is sufficient to address systemic problems," he continued. "I'm sharing it because I want you to understand the incredible power that each of you has to change someone's life. Sometimes the most profound act of service isn't about policy implementation or program administration. It's about recognizing the humanity in someone who feels forgotten by the world." He described the various veterans he had worked with through his volunteer activities. Sarah, the former medic who had become a certified nursing assistant. David, the Army Ranger, whose PTSD symptoms had stabilized enough for him to return to work as a security guard. Robert, the Marine whose disability benefits had finally been approved after a 2-year bureaucratic battle. Each of these individuals had skills, experience, and value to offer their communities, Marcus explained. What they needed wasn't just housing or job training. They needed someone to believe in their worth and to help them navigate systems that often seem designed to exhaust hope rather than restore it. As his speech continued, Marcus addressed the audience of professionals with specific recommendations based on his experiences both as a client and as a peer counselor. He spoke about the importance of treating people with dignity regardless of their circumstances, the need for coordinated services that address multiple challenges simultaneously, and the power of peer support in helping veterans transition from crisis to stability. The most effective programs I've encountered, he noted, are those that combine practical assistance with emotional support, that treat people as partners in their own recovery rather than passive recipients of charity, and that recognize that healing from trauma, whether military or civilian, is not a linear process with predictable timelines. After his formal presentation, Marcus opened the floor for questions. The responses revealed the deep impression his story had made on the audience. Social workers asked about replicating his peer counseling model in other communities. Government officials inquired about policy changes that might make services more accessible and effective. Fellow veterans shared their own experiences and asked for advice about their ongoing challenges. One question came from a young VA counselor who had been working with homeless veterans for only 6 months. "Mr. Williams, what would you say to someone like me who sometimes feels overwhelmed by the scope of the problems we're trying to address? How do you maintain hope when you see so much need and so many systemic barriers?" Marcus smiled, remembering his own moments of despair and the people who had refused to give up on him. "I would tell you to remember that you can't save everyone, and that's not your job anyway. Your job is to see each person as an individual with their own story, their own strengths, and their own capacity for change. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply witness someone struggle with respect and compassion. That alone can plant seeds of healing that grow in ways you might never see." After the conference ended, as people approached Marcus with business cards, program brochures, and requests for follow-up conversations, he found himself thinking about the unpredictable nature of human connection. 18 months earlier, he had been a desperate man approaching a stranger on a cold December morning, driven by hunger and hope in equal measure. That interaction had set in motion a chain of events that had not only transformed his own life, but had created opportunities for dozens of other veterans to find their way back from the margins of society. Karoline waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching him. "I am so incredibly proud of you," she said, embracing him warmly. "Not just for how far you've come, but for how you've used your experience to help others." "We make a good team," Marcus replied, returning her hug.